I'm Natalie. We're here in the UT Gardens with some of our tomato trials right behind us. And to discuss some tomato management issues today, I've brought in an extension friend and tomato expert from up the road.
My name's Anthony Carver. I'm a county extension agent in Granger County, Tennessee, home of the great tasting Granger County tomatoes.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about fertilization practices in the home garden, beginning with a soil test report and pre-plant application, and also addressing some of the ways that we will side dress or add fertilizer throughout the growing season.
Let's talk about what is actually in a fertilizer bag. We have a 10-10-10-10-10 fertilizer bag here with us today. Let's talk a little bit about what each number actually represents and how much actual units is in the bag. The first number will always represent nitrogen. Nitrogen actually helps the plant grow and develop leaf structure. The phosphorus, the second number, will always help with root development under the ground. So you'll see a lot of starter fertilizers have a high middle number. The third number is potassium, or potash some people refer to it as. It actually will help with the fruit development and actually enlarge your fruit and actually help with the water in your plants and also give a sweetness to your fruit.
So now you know a little bit about what is in the fertilizer bag. The most important question that you're probably asking is, how do I know how much to use? And that's where our soil test report comes in. By measuring how much of these nutrients we have in our garden soil already, we'll know how much we need to add to supply just the amount of nutrients that our plants need. So often those recommendations are given to us as a pre-plant, meaning before we plant the tomatoes, often we'll incorporate that into our garden soil, and as a side dressing, which is added while the fruit is developing. So for instance, if we were told by our soil test report that we needed to provide 2 pounds of nitrogen for 1,000 square feet, and we know that in this bag there's actually only 10% nitrogen, that would mean in our 1,000 square foot garden we'd need to apply 20 pounds of a 10-10-10, or 10 pounds of a 20-20-20.
We fertilized early to establish the crop, but now that the crop is already up and growing good for us, we need to add some more fertility to the mix.
So now that we have had a little bit of an introduction into fertilizer materials and how we provide nutrients pre-plant to get our plants started off in the growing season, we also want to think about how and why we provide nutrients throughout the course of the growing season. We'll call this a side dress. Oftentimes we'll apply nitrogen to keep our plants producing more leaves and able to photosynthesize, but we also want to keep in mind that if we provide only nitrogen and too much nitrogen, we could end up with a very lush plant that is not fruiting very well. That's something that's fairly common for tomatoes and even peppers in home gardens. So oftentimes we want to make sure that we provide some potassium throughout the growing season as well to support fruiting.
Today we have conventional materials for fertilizing, for side dressing with us as examples, but we always can use organic materials such as bone meal. We have 2 different types of commercial fertilizers. We have a granular slow release, which is a more pelletized material, or we can be using a water-soluble base fertilizer that actually will dissolve in your liquid. If you're using a water-soluble and you mix up the water and you have a solution that and then side dress it, you're only going to have about 1 week's worth of food for that plant. For the granular, that is a slow release, you could get up to 3 to 4 weeks of food for that plant.
With that overview of the 2 different kinds of fertilizers that we could use for side dressing, let's think about how that might pair with the different management systems that we use. For instance, if we have a bare ground around our plants, it would be pretty straightforward to band applicate a side dressing. We would just apply our fertilizer right along the side of the growing crop. However, if we had a plastic mulch or even a natural mulch of straw and newspaper, we would need to apply a soluble fertilizer that went through our drip line.
It's important to understand what type of tomato that you have. Tomatoes are labeled in 2 different groups, determinate and indeterminate.
Knowing which type of tomato we have helps us understand how best to manage it. For example, right here is an indeterminate tomato. And the most important characteristic for indeterminates is they continue to grow upward. They produce leaves and fruit clusters all at the same time.
A determinate variety is a shorter variety, usually gets around 3 to 4 feet tall, and actually will produce all of its fruit basically at one time.
So now that we understand a little bit about the two types of plants, another key characteristic in how we're going to be managing our plants is what type of support structure we're going to be using. Here we have examples of the stake and weave system, which work very well for determinate plants that we can support just a few plants or an entire row. For indeterminate plants, we might get to the point where they outgrow our stake and weave system. So those are things that need to come into consideration. Many people for indeterminates will use a cage system. Now make sure you use strong enough cages to support the weight of the plant for the entire crop, but they can provide a great way to lower your management throughout the season because the plant can get quite large and still be contained very well. It's also possible to use individual stakes to support individual plants. If you have a few plants, that can work very well. However, if you have a lot of plants, continuing to tie them up to an individual stake can be time-consuming. There are two reasons that we prune tomatoes. One would be so that we can control the growth of the plant and make sure that it fits with our support system.
The second reason is to prevent any type of future disease infection.
Here's an example of a sucker that we might remove. It's very low, and that means that it's not going to fit very well into our support system. Eventually, as it grows, it's going to be out into the aisle, and those fruit are probably going to be laying on the ground. It could also be using valuable energy that we might want to spend on these fruit up here. It's also important to think about some of these upper suckers. These we're going to leave on because they're going to be providing a lot of the future fruiting over the course of the summer, and they're going to be easily supported by continuing rows of twine traveling up our stakes. So let's give you a quick recap of pruning your tomatoes. It can be useful to remove a few leaves at the bottom of the plant, or maybe at the lower couple of suckers, but we'll want to make sure that we don't remove anything very close to our first fruiting cluster or above it. It's going to be those suckers that provide the flowers for our future fruit and all of those leaves that provide sugars to support our growing fruit.
It is important to leave a lot of leaf area in the top of the plant because we want shade for our fruit. If we do not shade our fruit, they will become sun-scald or sunburn from the sun. And that will cause dead area around the surface of the fruit itself and will be uneatable.
There may be times when you want to remove a few diseased leaves from the upper canopy. It's important to remember that you never want to take too many leaves off the plant at any one time because it can stress the plant and reduce its fruiting capacity.
Hopefully these tips will help you grow great tasting tomatoes in your own home garden.